This is Bible Academy. Today we start a new book, Ezekiel, one of the great prophets of the Old Testament. Now, before we begin, let's make sure that we have prepared ourselves to study the Word of God. We always want to make sure that we are right with the Lord by confessing our known sins. This keeps us in fellowship, keeps us walking with the Lord. This is according to 1 John 1:9. This is where you see one of the primary commands on it. We also are to make sure that we're allowing the Spirit to control us. That's a choice as well. This is taught in several places in the New Testament. You might especially look at Romans 6. We give ourselves over to the Spirit so we can be controlled by Him. Other terms are like walk in the Spirit, live by the Spirit. The idea is that you're empowered by the Spirit. And that's what we want to do if we're going to get the most out of this rather very fascinating and interesting study. So let's take a moment to pray. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we do thank you again for this opportunity and the privilege and all that you have provided for us. We ask now that our hearts and our minds be open and ready to hear this. In Jesus' name, amen. Ezekiel is one of the more fascinating books, primarily because of its visions, remarkable visions. I don't think there's anything comparable except probably Revelation. But in studying it, preparing for it over the last couple of months or so, it's a book that is difficult, I think, in interpreting because of the visions, and some of the Hebrew is just not real clear, and you'll see that in some of the interpretations. But anyway, it is a book we need to understand. Now, the other big thing is probably the historical background. We've studied Daniel, we've studied Jeremiah, and now we're studying Ezekiel and some of the minor prophets. But one of the things you need to keep in mind, if you don't know this already, is that the period towards the end of let me just put it this way, around 500 BC. Before that, back in the 600s, you have the fall of the northern kingdom. Then you have the fall of the southern kingdom. And this is, of course, a major event for the people of Israel. And most of your prophets write about it. And they write about their being punished because of their disobedience to the covenant, the Mosaic covenant, the old covenant. Now, we're under the new covenant. So this book is a real challenge because, well, I think it's interesting because Daniel was actually transported to Babylon and got up into the high ranks of the rulership. Ezekiel was transported to Babylon and actually placed outside one of the cities. So his perspective is different than Daniel's. Daniel is as basically royalty in the city of Babylon. And then there's Jeremiah, who stayed behind. He stayed behind in Judah. Much of their messages overlap in that they all speak of the coming judgment, the punishment, speaking of the restoration of Israel. Fascinating subjects. And we've studied this background from a number of books, including, I believe, Future History was one of the major ones, as well as the Old Testament Survey. And then several of the prophets give the same background as we have here. They're just different circumstances. Well, let's get started. Now, the background here is something that's important to understand. We all should be familiar with Nebuchadnezzar by now if you've studied many of the Old Testament books. He was the king of Babylon. He had consolidated his control in Babylon sometime after 605 BC. He was warring against Egypt. He's still trying to get this part of the world under his control. Earlier, Egypt had made Judah a vassal state and had been run out of Egypt by Babylon. So Egypt is run out of Judah, who had control of Judah. And then Judah was ruled by Jehoiakim at the time. They became Babylon's vassal state. So they switched from Egypt's vassal state to Babylon's. Now, in order to maintain Judean loyalty, Nebuchadnezzar took some of the Judean nobility, like Daniel and his friends, to Babylon. Jehoiakim rebelled 598-597 against Nebuchadnezzar, and after Nebuchadnezzar had enough of Jehoiakim, and then after a 3-month siege brought them to surrender. Jehoiakim was captured and apparently executed, Jeremiah 22:18-23 and 36:30. Jehoiachin was put in his place. He ruled only long enough to show himself evil and would or could not submit to Babylon. He was just too rowdy, you might say, too rebellious. He tried to acquire the aid of Egypt, and then Nebuchadnezzar in turn prompted severe penalties against Jehoiachin, the king, queen, high officials, and vast booty, including temple treasures, were taken to Babylon. So this is one of the deportations where King Jehoiachin, his queen, high officials, and vast booty, including temple treasures, were taken to Babylon. And this group included captives, including Ezekiel. Now, a number of captives were settled in a separate Jewish colony near a place called Nippur. Now, Nippur is about 62 miles east-southeast of ancient Babylon. You're just going to have to pull some maps out if you want to know where this is exactly. But it's about 62 miles, and there are a number of villages out there that now are being occupied by Judeans or Israelites. And Nippur was on the Chebar Canal, or sometimes called river. Now, this is a river that came up, basically it passed by Babylon, went down, almost down the middle between the Tigris and Euphrates River. Let me just kind of give you a map here, what this looked like. Okay, so you have, let's see here, we have Babylon. Okay, you have like the Tigris Euphrates River, and they'll run like this, okay, and they'll go down to the Persian Gulf. And down here, let's say about 62 miles, is Nippur. And they had little villages around here that they settled the Jews in. And right about, well, let's see if I can get this fairly accurate. Somewhere around here you had the Chebar. This is the Chebar. All right, it goes on down, okay? This is the Chebar River, or some will say canal. And this is where we find Ezekiel placed. Almost the Chebar Valley, or rather river, runs almost straight out of Babylon through Nippur. Now keep in mind, Babylon was considered both the city proper and the country as it expanded, because the king of Babylon is becoming the king of basically much of the Middle East. Now Jehoiachin was replaced by Josiah, one of his youngest son, Mattaniah. Now, Josiah was one of the better kings, at least towards the end, but he kind of fizzled out too, and he was killed. And Mattaniah, he was renamed Zedekiah. He would be the last descendant of David on the throne at Jerusalem and was a complete failure. He, with nearby Tyre and Ammon, began an open revolt. Jerusalem was invaded and put under siege. The siege took a year before the walls were breached. So we're talking about the point here that Jerusalem fell with the walls and the temple and the city all destroyed after Ezekiel was back in or taken over to Babylon and in Nippur. So when I say Babylon, for Ezekiel, I mean Nippur. For Daniel, it would be just Babylon, the city. The siege took a year before the walls were breached. As I said, Zedekiah fled, that's the king, but was captured, eyes gouged out, and taken to Babylon. 2 months later, Nebuchadnezzar's general, Nebuzaradan, torched the city. The temple was made into rubble, and with only a few survivors who would try to live among the ruins. Judah was done for as a nation for now. Basically, it vanished. It fulfilled the fifth cycle of discipline from the Old Covenant. We call it the Old Covenant. It's the Mosaic Covenant, Mosaic Law. And so they're gone, basically. They're gone. And this was a shock. And you can imagine people had been promised by God that they would have a future, a king from the Davidic line on the throne forever. What happened? Well, this left the Jews in 3 primary locations. Those who escaped to Egypt, like Jeremiah went there. Not necessarily escape, but he went with the people that were left. So they escaped to Egypt, though there were some who had settled there actually earlier, so there were already settlements of Jews in Egypt. And you have the poor people that's left behind in Judah, and those you have in captivity now in Babylon. So you have men, some in Judah, Egypt, and now Babylon. Ezekiel's primary audience would be those in Babylon. Neo-Assyrian records reveal that hundreds of thousands from the northern kingdom had been dispersed throughout the empire. So we already have those from the northern kingdom, which had fell centuries so earlier. Even though the Judean exiles integrated rapidly among the Babylonians, they managed to maintain their ethnic and social community, something the Jews are pretty good at doing. However, they did have to deal with the environment of paganism and idol worship. But they did hold on to their belief that Yahweh would rescue them and their connection to the promised land. But they're in a very discouraging situation right now. It seems that they held to no less than 4 major promises. Let me remind you of those. You probably could tell me them if you studied much of the Old Testament yourself, especially the prophets. The covenant given at Sinai, God would keep his covenant. Blessing if they turn back to the Lord. Yahweh's covenant with David, that's the Davidic covenant, the promise of a future king on the throne of David forever. Yahweh's ownership of the land, there's always a land promise. That goes back to even to Abraham. And then Yahweh's proper residence in the temple in Jerusalem. Now that was messed up because he's not there now. There's no temple, there's no Jerusalem. So something's going to have to happen. I believe many of them still had a hope that things would turn around. That's why they get excited if they saw something coming their direction. It's kind of like people today will hear something and they'll say, oh, the rapture's coming or the tribulation's coming when they see an event happen. But these things happen throughout history, and they often don't mean much. But eventually that will all come about. Well, what had been their dreams of being in Jerusalem all seemed to be gone. With Jerusalem collapsed, the house of David was cut off. That's a big one. The temple destroyed, where would the Lord be? And the nation now exiled from the land. No doubt there were many who who were disillusioned now about the power of Yahweh, feeling betrayed and perhaps abandoned. They were bitter and angry. It appeared as if Marduk, the god of Babylon, had prevailed. Would anyone come to the rescue? Well, let's look at the author and date. What we know about Ezekiel, we learn from his prophecies. Let's look at his name for a moment. Transliteration. Ezekiel. God gives strength, or may God strengthen. That's the meaning of it. God gives strength, or may God strengthen. And he lives up to his name, as we will see demonstrated by his consistent stand against opposition. In verse 1:1, which I put up here, it says, in the 30th year, apparently referring to his age at 30, he saw visions of God. Now, his ministry would exceed the normal span of priestly ministry by 2 years. That's just to kind of keep in our back pocket until we get there. The 30th year of Ezekiel is related to the 5th year of Jehoiachin's exile by the same day of the month and probably the same month. So that was a marked year. In 1:3, he's identified as a priest, the son of Buzi, and shows himself to take his call seriously. We know nothing of his family except that he did get married, and his position as a prophet brought a toll on his marriage. As a sign of what Israel was about to experience, Yahweh brought about the death of his wife and forbade the prophet to express outward expressions of his grief. That's in 24:15 through 27. He was a man of high intellect, a vast knowledge of his own nation's traditions, international affairs, and history, something that I think we as Christians ought to be aware of. More than any other prophet, he acted out prophecies with symbolism. The dating of the book comes from the words of Ezekiel, who dated many of his oracles. 14 oracles provide date notices and are spread across the book. These help us provide a chronological framework for his ministry. By providing dates, this shows that the prophecies were before the event, as they should be. Ezekiel received his call to ministry in 593. He was active for 22 years and received his last dated oracle in 571 BC. This places his span of ministry across the darkest period for Judah, beginning 7 years before the final fall in 586 and extended 14 years afterward. So his ministry is basically right in the middle of one of the worst periods for Judah. The theme. Let's put this on the board. We'll read it together. Opportunity for you to check my spelling. Here we go. The theme. The theme is both simple and very basic to the believer's life. Without God, there is no real life. God's people were to learn that without God living the obedient life, then life passes without any real significance. It's amazing to me how many people have really no significance to their life. Of course, they attach significance from what happens in the world, how much money they make, what they accomplish. Often those who don't accomplish too much may have a family, and then their accomplishments are in their family and then through their kids and so on. But without God, life really has no real significance. In fact, I've said things like, you're not really living. You don't know what it is until you live with God in your life. In his visions, Ezekiel observed, listen to this, the Spirit leaving the temple. That basically means God leaving Israel, which was when God withdrew his presence from Israel. That's down in Judah in the temple. And disaster followed in the lives of the people of Israel. So Ezekiel spent much of his ministry pleading with the people to turn back to the Lord, but they refused. An old story with the prophets. Until they did return, then life was worth little. However, there would be life in the future when the people did return, but that would ultimately come through their turning to the Lord Jesus Christ at the end of the age. So we know they have that return to the land when the 70 years of discipline are over. Some do not return, as Daniel and others. But they return to the land. But the big return is when they also turn to Christ at his second coming. Well, I had the outline up there. Let's get it back up there. I shouldn't have scrolled that down. So here's just the first part of the outline. It's just the major points. Now, you see part 1. That's because the book is basically divided in half. I'll talk about that in a moment. That's chapters 1 through 24. But then we have Roman numeral 1 in part 1. Ezekiel's commission and call to prophetic ministry. This covers the first 3 chapters, where you have the setting, the inaugural vision, Ezekiel's commission, the preparation of Ezekiel, Ezekiel a watchman to Israel, initiation of Ezekiel. So this really orients us to Ezekiel's responsibilities, his ministry. As I said, the book is divided into 2 parts. Parts 1, chapters 1 through 24, and part 2, chapters 25, 1 through 48, 35. That's the end of the book. The first major section, part 1, is addressed to the people of Judah in a time of crisis during the period between 598 and 586. That's the big fall, 586. By the dating, like we'll see in 1:1, 1, 2, and 3, 3:16, 8:1, 21, 24:1, etc., etc., we see that these revelations and oracles were all received and delivered within a span of 6 or 7 years. Pretty short span. These were all just before the fall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. This is the group I'm talking about. I'll repeat that. These were all just before the fall of Jerusalem by the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. The prophet continuously offers warnings of impending judgment. Now, remember, Ezekiel is over in the area of Babylon, but Judah is still intact, and not completely wiped out yet. And these messages get back there, and the people still wouldn't listen. The first subsection, Roman numeral 1, we have the commission and call of the prophet, as we had just in the outline. The text involves just Yahweh and his prophet. Now, you'll hear me refer to the Lord more as Yahweh in this book. And keeping in mind that's the name, the personal divine name of the God of Israel. The Hebrew term for God is Elohim, the personal name for God, as opposed to someone like Marduk or Baal. His name of the God, the name of the God of Israel is Yahweh, which is also translated Lord with the 4 capital letters. Now we'll see symbolic actions, and these are to prepare the prophet for his mission, not to communicate some aspect of Yahweh's message to his people. But then in chapter 4, the symbolic actions of the prophet do relate to the message for the audience. So we have some early symbolism that is to prepare him for his mission. Okay. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot more time on the background. There's a whole lot I could say, but it goes on, and a lot of it is relevant and good, but I have a tendency to stray away from the long backgrounds just because I think we need to get into the book That takes priority. So you can see the priority is to learn the book. So, where's Ezekiel? He's in Babylon, in Nippur. Verse 1, chapter 1 of Ezekiel. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, see how specific it is? As I was among the exiles by the Chebar river, the heavens were opened, and I saw a divine vision. The setting works here like a superscription that we see in places like the Psalms. It's a heading. The heading here seeks to fix the date of this inaugural vision. It's also written in the first person. We see it related to two sets of dates and events. First of all, we see in the 30th year. This seems best to take this as Ezekiel's age. It doesn't say he was 30 years old, but when we look at the 30th year, this is basically through a process of elimination. It's the only one that makes sense. Makes the best sense. 30 is also the year that priests qualified for the induction into their office, so that fits well there. Assuming a spring new year, the call came on the 5th day of Tammuz, which for year 593 BC, it would have been July 31st. Ezekiel writes that he was by the Chebar River. Now, you'll often see translations use canal, but I finally settled on river. This river or canal flowed southeast from the city of Babylon, as I drew on that map. It was one of the many branches of canal system that distributed water through the Tigris and Euphrates throughout the city and round about. You know, the only water wasn't just the Tigris and Euphrates. There was streams or rivers in between and around. It was in the area of Nippur, another city actually where Ezekiel was sent with the other Judean exiles. So now we have his location. This determines his location. So we have both the date and the location he received his first vision. Pretty specific. It says, and I was among the exiles. Notice the first person, and I was among the exiles. The point here is that he was away from Jerusalem and the temple, the place of Yahweh's glory in the past. Now listen to this. Remember, Jerusalem's going to be shut down, but right now God is operating with Ezekiel in Nippur outside Babylon. And this might surprise some people, that God is actually working outside his, as the pagans would say it, his assigned territory. You see, the gods of the nations, basically they were God over that nation in that land. But now we have a good example of God working all around. Now he's among the exiles, who are, for the most part, under punishment for their disobedience. So he's even with them for those who want to know him. So here we have Ezekiel, someone who did want to do God's will, but found himself caught up in the nation's punishment. But God's still with him. Don't miss that important message, folks. If you are following Christ, God will never leave you. He will never forsake you. He will never abandon you, no matter what happens. So, we have him among the exiles under the curse of punishment for their disobedience. Well, it's time for Ezekiel to begin his service. It shows that God may call anyone to ministry anywhere under any circumstance. This event would have dispelled the myth that a patron god, that of Babylon, would have jurisdiction over the events in his land, and that one had to be physically present in the land of his own God to have access to his God. So God showing up to Ezekiel dispels two myths, like that of the Babylonians, who believed Marduk was ruler over their land. So Yahweh, fine, but he's back over Israel. No, Yahweh's there with Ezekiel. So the God of Israel could go anywhere he wanted. Now, this first vision begins with the phrase, the heavens were opened. Now, maybe a little more better for us to understand, the skies opened up. It's like you have a special sight into the throne room of God, which is what this amounts to. And then we have this phrase, and I saw a divine vision. Now, literally this says visions of God. So that's kind of the impression. He got these visions of God, but specifically it would be a divine vision of God in heaven. So Ezekiel received a look into the supernatural activities of the third heaven. Verse 2. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. Okay. It appears that verse 2 is to be synchronized with the first verse and bringing in its relationship to the time of the exile. We just saw that in the background. This sets the pattern for the manner of dating prophecies throughout the book. Though Jehoiachin had only reigned 3 months and 10 days and had no significant impact on Israel's history, but his removal, now listen to this, his removal and exile to Babylon represented a turning point in Israel's history. The Davidic line of a succession of kings had come to an abrupt stop. I'll bet it was only a temporary one. It does help explain why Ezekiel mentioned this, because it brought the line to an end. And there's no coincidence in God's plan. And by the way, Zedekiah, he is from a secondary line, the one that came in afterwards. It's the same year that marked the date of Ezekiel's first vision. So the last king of David out, Ezekiel's first vision in. Now, important lesson. Now listen carefully. I don't care where you live, what country you live in. I can certainly vouch for the United States. This important lesson, here it is. Ezekiel was caught up in the divine discipline of his nation that as a whole had rejected Yahweh and his covenant. They had turned to other gods and rejected the teaching of the covenant. No different than many countries around the world, and I can vouch for the United States. Though Ezekiel may have thought his dreams of service in the temple were over and there was little future left for him in ministry, that was not the case at all. He would become one of the most significant prophets in the history of Israel. With Jehoiachin also as a captive as well as himself, it probably made him think of what would become of the promises to Israel and its people. Remember, he's going through the same mindset, the same experience that the captives were. They were no longer functioning as God's people in the land with the temple. Their primary system of worship and offering and sacrifice and priesthood and so on had largely been set aside. Without a temple, well, where's God going to be? We answer that question. But Ezekiel also knows that though there has always been some major changes, their future still rests upon them. What would they do in these circumstances now? They were still alive. Now listen, and they were still able to hear the messages. Folks, the condition of the United States and many other countries in the world may stay just like this for a long time. It'll be a real testing period. But it would be nice to have more people hungry for the Word, more churches teaching the Word, and to have a more positive nation towards God's truths. But they were still alive and still able to hear his messages. That's you and me. Never think that God is not able to be with you through all of this and you to have an active purpose and ministry. Another thing about the date that we determined was on 31 July 593 BC. It was also the time in which Zedekiah, the successor of Jehoiachin, visited Babylon. So you have a visitation from the assigned king in Babylon coming to visit the king of Babylon. The exiles would have known about this visit. This might have heightened their expectation that the people's release and return to the land would happen soon, but nothing like this would happen. Yahweh's discipline and his word on the 70-year captivity remained intact. They would go through their discipline. And this is 7 years. Now listen, this is 7 years before the temple's destroyed. Well, the temple's still there. Most of the city's still there. So maybe we'll get to go back now. No. It will yet be destroyed in about 7 more years. It'll all be gone. Jerusalem and the temple. What would they go back to? Rubble. Verse 3 gives us some specifics about Ezekiel's call. Verse 3, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, the priest, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Chebar river, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. Let's begin with the phrase, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel. This refers to the event of the revelation coming to the mind of Ezekiel. It could refer to both visual and a verbal revelation. Then we have to Ezekiel, the son of Buzi, the priest. I looked at his name already. May God strengthen or toughen. The naming shows his faith, show the faith of his parents at birth by naming him something like this. His father's name was Buzi. Now, many translations place the title, that is, the priest, after Ezekiel, which is possible, but in the Hebrew, the placement is right after the phrase, the son of Buzi. So it could be that he was the priest. One cannot be certain who the title applies to. Since Ezekiel left Jerusalem at the age one would become a priest, that he would be inducted into the priesthood, the title probably refers to his father. So both would have been priests, perhaps. That's possible. Let's just put it that way. In the land of the Chaldeans by the Chebar River, the Chaldeans is an older name for the Babylonians. Often, I think their placement is south, probably near Nippur than what we have it in the original Babylon. So anyway, they're southeast of the city of Babylon, as I drew on that map earlier. And notice, and the hand of the Lord was upon him there. This is always a remarkable experience to those who are in ministry. But the Lord can place his hand on anybody at any time and move them to do what he would have them do. We'll also learn the hand of God may also move a person from one place to another, completely controlling his movements. Now, before we look at this vision, we should look at a wider picture here. This is the first vision of Ezekiel. The Hebrew, which is difficult, indicates that much of the difficulty is due to him writing in an excited state. All kinds of issues with the translation. It's somewhat garbled and obscure even. The good news is that he later gets a similar vision in chapter 10, and that helps us better understand this one. But even with its unclear communication, we can discern an outline, and I'm going to put that up for you under point B. The inaugural vision, 1:4 through 28a, and here we have it. We have introduction, verse 4. Then we get a description of the living creatures, and then the wheels, the platform and throne, and concluding observation. All right, so we will see there's also a fire motive, a storm motive, and a radiant glory. All right, those things keep coming out. All of it has an ominous tone to it. Though we do not know what Ezekiel was doing at the time when he received the vision, we do know that he felt a sharp north wind and the sign of an enormous cloud showed up, ablaze with fiery light. Verse 4. As I looked, behold, a high wind was coming from the north, a great cloud with fire flashing intermittently, and a radiance around it. In the midst of the fire, a gleaming metal. That's the way Ezekiel chooses to describe it. Some will use the translation glowing amber instead of gleaming metal. So picture a great cloud, fire flashing intermittently. You'd think of maybe lightning. But it was radiant all around it. But in the midst of it, you could see, in the midst of the fire, you could see a gleaming metal, something shiny. Okay? So to break this down a little bit, the great cloud was blown in by the strong wind. The radiance of the cloud was described here, with fire flashing intermittently back and forth, possibly lightning bolts, as I mentioned. And the radiance around it seemed like the whole thing just shined. A brightness surrounding it in the midst of the fire, a gleaming metal. The idea of gleaming metal, I got both words up here, ayin kashmal. Glowing amber is another translation. You'll see it's like molten metal in a furnace. So you see this very hot looking spot. All right, now verse 5 begins to describe the living creatures. Let's read 5 through 8. So we're going to expand this a little bit. Okay. All right, we'll just stop like that. Stop right there. Here we go. Verse 5. And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and their feet were like a calf's hoof. Well, some will say maybe the soles of their feet. And they sparkled like polished bronze. Under the wings, all their 4 sides were human hands. Now we'll just stop there. So under their wings, on their 4 sides were human hands. So here in verses 5 through 8a, these verses sum up the primary features of each creature. First noticeable is that they were composed of different other creature parts. Their bodies were human-like, I should say, but they had 4 faces and 4 wings. Though they had straight legs, their feet were like that of a calf's hoof and sparkled like polished bronze. Now you may be thinking, that is just an odd looking thing. Yes, it would be to us, but not so much to those in the ancient world, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. So we have attached to their bodies, under their wings, were human-like hands. So they have arms? I suppose they did, but that's not mentioned. Some sort of arms or forearm or something. But anyway, it's not going to look so weird that it doesn't look perfectly functional. Okay. So 8b, it says, as for the faces and wings of the four of them. Now we go to getting a little more detail on the description. So let's just read 8, 9, and 10. There's nothing here we could spend our time on it, but you get the impression, or you don't, hear what we're looking at, something really fascinating and unusual. So as for their faces and wings of the four of them, listen to this. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. See, you can imagine this is difficult. Not only difficult to understand, but comprehend in your mind. But think of what Ezekiel was going through, how to describe this. As for the likeness of their faces, this is verse 10, each had a human face. The four had the face of a lion on the right side, the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and the four had the face of an eagle. So they have these four faces on these four human-like bodies with also had hands, the straight legs, and the calf's hoofs. You got it? Maybe I should give you a moment to create this thing in your mind. I'm not even going to begin to try to draw this because I don't know how accurate it would be, you see. But you're reading what Ezekiel could do with it. Okay, let's move on. With their four faces facing four directions, they would move any direction without turning their bodies. Is that interesting? Their front face was human, as might be expected. Then the other faces were of three earthly creatures. The selection of these animals was not unusual for those of the ancient world. Now, here's what we got to understand. This, I remember earlier I said I would get to this. These type of creatures, a combination of human and animals, was not uncommon in the ancient iconographic and glyptic, that's the engravings, art. So you would see things on their walls, or maybe some sort of statue of these creatures that look like humans, and they look like creatures and different parts of creatures, depending on what they're trying to depict with the symbols. So all these things had a symbolic significance for the Israelites. So if we saw this today in, typical art, we'd say, well, that's bizarre, but that's not outside the realm of what people draw all the time nowadays with all the creatures. You watch television, you see these creatures that look so weird, they try to portray an alien, and you never know. Usually they have they're bare-bodied and the big heads and skinny bodies or something, but there's all kinds of aliens we see out there now. Okay? But that's imagination. That's artwork. So we're kind of talking about, in the ancient world, they try to portray their gods with these different types of animal parts or abilities, or actually it might be someone who served them or some creature that served them and have these abilities. One real, they would, and we'll see more of this here in a moment, but they'll portray something that's popular or well known, and they'll put it in their creature picture or something. And, oh, I know what that means. You see. Well, we see the picture of a lion, the face of a lion. It was known for its ferocity, strength, and courage, and often served as a symbol for royalty. Another one of the faces was an eagle. The eagle represented swiftness, and it was one of the most stately of birds. The ox, or the bull, was one of the most valuable domestic animals and was also symbolic of fertility and divinity. The human being face was known to have been created in the image of God and the most noble of all. Now, what we're going to see is they're carrying the divine throne. We have to get a ways before we see that, but this is getting to the creatures who's going to be carrying it. So the fact that they carry the divine throne symbolizes they expressed aspects of the divine nature of the one they carried. God is, of course, stately and noble, And he produces, he creates humans, gives them the ability to procreate, create themselves. The human has been created in the image of God, most noble of all, should be betraying wisdom. The fact that they carried the divine throne symbolizes they expressed aspects of the divine nature, the one they carried. Their creator had the strength and the majesty of the lion, the swiftness and the mobility of the eagle, the procreative power of the bull, and the wisdom and reason of humans. Okay? So there is a reason for their strange appearance. There's no comment on their hands. Not sure why. It's just probably not significant. So it sums up in the next line of verse 11, such were their faces. So now we know what their faces were like. Now we start in the next section. 11b begins to describe their wings. There's no comment, like I said, on their hands. So their wings, it says, and their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. Let's just look at verse 11 for a moment. One pair of wings was extended so that it touched the tips of the creature opposite. So I'm picturing it, stretched out. If you had a 4-corner platform, his wing is stretched out to touch the tip of the other one on the other side. This is similar to the cherubim over the Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies, if you're familiar with that picture. Rather than call them cherubim, which they were called later in chapter 10, he continues to call them living creatures. That's what it is in the translation, or creature, or living being. But he don't actually call them cherubim till later on, but we know what they are. So he calls them living creatures or beings, as some other translations actually have it. There's no description of their wings or legs or feet moving the vehicle. Isn't that strange? Later in Ezekiel, verses 24, 25, he does say that when the vehicle stopped, the wings were lowered. So it appears that they might move them, but it doesn't seem to show that movement. Anyway, it's, like I said, it's hard to comprehend. The living creatures would move when the Spirit moved. That's what we will get out of this. Verse 11, and each went straight forward. Whenever the Spirit would go, they went without turning as they went. So, at least we can get this out of it. The cherubim would move synchronized with the Spirit. I'm more on the Spirit in verse 20. Just hold on. Notice I didn't capitalize it here. It may have been capitalized. It just depends on how you interpret this specifically. We're not mentioned in the text of 4 as the number of the creatures represent 4 directions of the compass. So that's often common. That's sort of implied here. Well, it's true that depictions were common in the ancient world of combined animal and human creatures, like a winged bull with a human head. You'll see that picture. It's a popular one. Nowhere else do we have such a combination as we have here. So it is rare, if it does show up somewhere else, to have 4 heads on a single living creature. So this imagery would not have been a shock to Ezekiel, just somewhat different. So that's what I was telling you about the different art. They're used to seeing it in art. It wouldn't be a shock. It's like there's not much that shocks us now from alien scenes on any movie, or whether, they're actually foreign aliens or just something already on the earth, something like that. Now remember, with all of this, there was a stunning brilliance of their brightness. Verse 13, as for the likeness of the living creatures, listen to this, their appearance was like burning coals of a fire, like the appearance of torches. So here it appears that Ezekiel sort of, I don't want to mischaracterize him, but he's sort of hunting for words to describe it. And I can imagine being in that position and thinking, how am I going to describe this? So he appears to be doing his best here, like the appearance of torches. So burning fire, burning coals of fire like the appearance of torches. It moved back and forth among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning. All right, now that we're getting to the heart of the cloud, you might say, that had all this flashing and brilliance and radiance. But keep the idea of radiance here and brilliance. Verse 14, and the living creatures darted back and forth like the appearance of a flash of lightning. Now, how does this fit in? Well, it's hard to imagine. But it looks as though Ezekiel is really at a loss of precise words to describe their movement and brightness. So he uses these words that we see here. At any rate, we do understand it was bright, it was flashing, and moving rapidly. Now, what else can I do with this? Well, just leave it up to your own imagination, what you come up with. In verses 15 through 21, we look at the wheels. Let's look at verse 15 first. As I looked at the living creatures, behold, there was one wheel on the ground beside the living beings for each one of them. And folks, I went over this in the Hebrew in some of these verses, and you just don't get any more out of it than basically what the translation says. And we have to go with that, of course. All right, so you have these wheels on the ground beside the living beings. Each one of the four creatures had these wheels. So each creature had one wheel beside him. That's what it says for each of the four of them. All right? And it does say one. That's the word in the Hebrew. One. There was one wheel on the ground. Verse 16. The appearance of the wheels and their workmanship was like sparkle of beryl. And all four of them had the same form. Their appearance and workmanship were as if one wheel were within another. All right, let's start with the beryl. What is beryl? Well, the word is Tarshish. I'll put it on the board. Manage this. It's a yellow jasper. Different translations have, well, let's see, different translations. The NIV, NASB has topaz. The net says jasper. King James ESV says beryl. All right. So you have this color. All right. I just translated yellow jasper. You can look up the word jasper and see what it looks like. Many of these jewels have the same name, but they're different colors. But my perhaps idea is that's a bright yellow. And then they describe the wheels. One wheel within the other, as if one wheel were within the other. So what do we have here? Is it concentric wheels? Or they're on casters. Maybe you've seen that. Swiveling casters. Or that right angles to each other. The point that we're to get from this is that they can move in all directions. Now, what's interesting, verse 17, when they went in any of their four directions without turning as they went. So now we have these wheels, but they don't turn. That's what it says. So it seems to be saying that the wheels can go in any direction, but do not move. This would make them perhaps somewhat symbolic of their fluid mobility, able to go any direction without resistance of any sort. And the wheels go where the cherubim go. So my imagination, and it's not so much imagination, I think it comes pretty clear here that these cherubim with the wheels beside them, perhaps just, somehow it's sitting on a platform on the wheels and they're there to move them, and yet it's the Spirit that actually does the movement. So it is hard to figure this out exactly, and it's not our concern, but it was a fascinating thing to perceive. And then we have the magnificent description of the wheels, verse 18. And their rims were high and awesome, and the rims of all four wheels were full of eyes all around. Now, the idea of eyes all around is commonly interpreted as see everywhere. But I think I have a different take on this, and I'm not the only one. So what we have here is the rims not only gleamed as beryl, but were high and awesome to look at. So they must have been unusually high. I'm thinking of just big, all right, to hold this platform way up in the air, which we haven't got to yet. These eyes have sometimes been, as I said, interpreted as the all-seeing eye or all-knowing character of God, but I don't think so, not for the wheels. So I think it's best to take these as actually jewels on the wheels that were shaped like eyes, kind of like eye jewels, if you can picture that. You've seen some of those ancient statues of, they'll have a god or something, they'll have its eyes or jewels, or have something in its head that's a jewel. I think we have the same idea here. So see, we can use our imaginations too from what we've seen in our movies or books. Verse 19, and when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. When the living beings rose up from the ground, the wheels rose up. Isn't that interesting? The wheels move in perfect harmony with the creatures. This in itself must have been a sight to behold, further showing the fascination of things that surround the Lord. Well, that brings us to how the Spirit operates here, the Spirit of the wheels, and that's where we'll continue next time in our study. Let's pray. Oh, Father, this has been a fascinating vision to look at, but help us not forget that this is in the midst of a situation where Ezekiel is looking at a people who are somewhat disillusioned, but yet you have a purpose and this time in history for him to minister. So, Lord, help us make the proper application of how you will use us, any place, any time, where we are, and that you will always be with us. We thank you for these things in Jesus' name. Amen.